by Sarah Schoenfeld, who's a historian, co-founder of Prologue DC, Carolyn Swope, who's a doctoral student for Columbia University, Johanna Bachman, who's a PhD, associate professor at George Mason University, and Michael Fisher Jr., who's a PhD, assistant professor at San Jose State University. I'm gonna give you a brief description of the presentation this afternoon and a short bio, and then we'll get started. As new development and gentrification continues to deplete DC of Black residents, who now comprise just 46% of the population, down from over 70% in the 1970s, this panel addresses modes of Black displacement over the course of the 20th century. We'll begin with a big picture via an overview of the online exhibit Mapping Displacement, launched in 2021. Other panelists will hone in on the role of alley clearance in dispersing longstanding Black communities, the repeated eviction of Black residents from one square block on Capitol Hill, and the anti-Black racism that undergirds the transformation of public housing into mixed income new communities, using Southeast's Berry Farm dwellings as a case study. This panel will provide context for understanding the impact of gentrification of Black DC today as a continuation of historical movements that have repeatedly destabilized and removed Black residents from spaces deemed too valuable for them to occupy. We're going to start off with Sarah Jane Schoenfeld. She's an independent scholar and public historian. Her work addresses DC's racialized housing landscape and planning regime, the intersection of race and historic preservation, and the history of organizing around civil rights and Black governance in DC. She co-founded the digital public history project, Mapping Segregation in Washington, DC, and helped to get a section of DC's Berry Farm dwellings public housing project designated as a historic landmark. Sarah?
Thank you, everyone, for choosing our session. And thank you, Daniel, for introducing us. So again, I'm Sarah Schoenfeld. My presentation today will walk you through an online exhibit, a story map created as part of the larger online public history project called Mapping Segregation in Washington, DC. Central to this larger project, which many of you may now be familiar with because we've been presenting on it over the years at this conference, is the mapping of space within the district that was reserved for whites only via the use of racially restrictive deed covenants. The Mapping Displacement exhibit that I'll show you today consists mostly of a series of maps illustrating the historic widespread presence of distinct Black communities throughout the DC area, the elimination of these communities, and the subsequent concentration of Black residents in certain sections of the city. So this is essentially a macro level view of serial displacement, and the presentations that follow will focus more narrowly on the clearance of alley dwellings and on a couple of specific communities that have been impacted by and resisted displacement. Okay, so I want to start by briefly recognizing who lived in this area before the period of Black and European settlement in the 1700s. Until the 1690s, the land that became DC was home to the Nacotchonk or the Nacastans. Evidence of their quarries were later found all over upper Northwest DC. Those are shown, the triangles on the map exhibit those. As late as 1890, a Smithsonian anthropologist wrote that the stone tools they created were, quote, so numerous in certain localities that they are brought in with every load of gravel from the creek beds. And the laborer who sits by the wayside breaking boulders for our streets each year passes them by thousands beneath his hammer. And it is literally true. It is literally true that the city, the capital of a civilized nation, is paved with the art remains of a race who occupied its site. And actually, let me go back to that. So the densest site of indigenous settlement was along the east branch of the Potomac, later named the Anacostia. The area, shoot, I meant to bring my, is this a pointer? All right, so the densest site of indigenous settlement was along the east branch of the Anacostia. And just for reference, this area, so this area just below the river's bend here, is where the Freedmen's Village of Berry Farm was established, would be established in 1867. And I mentioned that because this is Berry Farm is going to be sort of a recurring theme today. So this next map shows about 150 Black communities in and around the district that had formed by the end of the 19th century. Many were established by formerly enslaved people shortly after the Civil War, and some, like the one around Fort Stevens, predated that period. The number and size of these communities began to shrink in the early 20th century as land within and beyond the district was subdivided and sold for the development of white-only subdivisions. The Federal Housing Administration recommended the use of racially restrictive deed covenants and other tools such as segregated schools and physical barriers in order to create segregated white enclaves in areas where Black people had lived for generations. This map displays where the FHA guaranteed loans and accordingly areas from which Black communities were displaced during just the first 2 years of the agency's existence. The map displays in blue the location of racially restricted, or I'm sorry, it's this next map now, lots of maps. So this map displays in blue the location of racially restricted property within the bounds of the district. So this is all of the restricted lots that we've mapped thus far. In addition to covenants, tools such as eminent domain or the eviction of renters by white landlords were used to clear these areas of Black households. As a result, a number of Black enclaves in quiet sections of upper Northwest DC were eliminated in the early decades of the 20th century. Many would be pushed to the areas on the map where you don't see racial covenants. So to the city's oldest housing stock in downtown DC. I'm in a weird angle to this map, but so like around here, and then to sort of the most remote northeast and southeast sections of DC. And so, for example, here's a map that my colleague Mara Cherkasky made showing the displacement of longstanding Black community from Meridian Hill. You can see that almost all of them moved in the same direction toward downtown or points further southeast that were already home to a high percentage of Black households. As many Black Washingtonians or former residents of Maryland and Virginia were pushed into overcrowded housing downtown, the population of DC's alley communities, which had once been racially mixed, becomes almost entirely Black by the 1880s. At the same time, in large part due to the use of racial covenants and the emergence of the real estate industry, Blackness becomes associated with the devaluation of property. And now that much of downtown DC is filled with poor Black residents, an idea known as slum clearance gains traction. Under the theory that conditions such as poverty, poor health, or the criminality that was said to characterize these communities could be addressed by eliminating so-called slum housing and forcing people to move. This program leads to the establishment of DC's Alley Dwelling Authority in the 1930s. And the ADA serves to institutionalize this program of demolishing people's homes in the name of public health and safety. So the red dots on this map represent all of DC's alley dwellings in 1912. And then this is what the same area looks like in 1945, after much of this housing was torn down. So in most cases, rather than providing these people with new housing, and so that the space could be reserved for development later, alley dwellings were not replaced with new housing, but instead with garages or parking lots. And Carolyn will discuss in more detail what actually replaced the households that had lived in these spaces. Even once the city's public housing authority was established in 1943 and charged with providing new replacement housing to people evicted from alleys downtown, people were often pushed out of their old homes long before new developments were available, and there was never enough new housing to accommodate them, especially if they had large families. There were also strict application criteria, so many displaced residents were left with nowhere to live. And I think as Michael will probably address, all of these same issues are still with us today when it comes to the demolition of public housing. And in some cases, when new housing was built, it was constructed on land actually taken by eminent domain from Black landowners. For example, at Berry Farm, as will be discussed, and at Frederick Douglass dwellings. And as you can see, much of the public housing was built in these isolated sections of far northeast and southeast that I pointed out earlier. And in fact, despite the severe housing shortage for Black Washingtonians, the Housing Authority initially had a hard time finding tenants for Douglas dwellings because even people who had nowhere else to live dreaded so much moving that far away from the places where, from downtown, really. Public housing was also segregated, which means that even in areas that had been racially mixed, like Capitol Hill, new public housing was built either for white people or for Black people. So for example, the all-white Ellen Wilson dwellings, which Johanna will discuss, was built on a block that had been filled with Black occupied housing. And much of the public housing that was built in the 1940s was for whites only, including all of the largest developments shown here. So the largest circles you see are like 2,000 units and more, and then they go down from there. And although the city's Black population was rapidly increasing during a period when they were barred from most privately owned housing, all of the public housing shown here with the transparent circles was sold off or torn down after the war, so after World War II. And so this is what the public housing supply looks like in 1950, just before DC becomes ground zero for a nationwide urban renewal program that demolishes entire neighborhoods and is dubbed Negro removal for its disproportionate impact on Black people. In DC, 23,000 people are uprooted from Southwest, and while some have other options, many are forced to move to public housing. So it's during this period that we begin to see the concentration of new public housing east of the Anacostia River and just west of the river, sort of around, especially around the Navy Yard area. There was none built any further north or west of what you see here. So almost all of it gets concentrated in sections of the city that are difficult to get to and from, and often lack sufficient infrastructure or amenities. By this time, DC's public housing population was almost entirely Black, and by 1962, there were already 5,000 families on the wait list for it, which was projected to increase by 1,500 people a year. Between 1960 and 1980, even more projects are added to the existing cluster in far northeast DC. So over, well, you can probably see that where far northeast DC is. But you also do finally get the creation of some public housing in Northwest DC, primarily to serve seniors or disabled residents. It looks on the map like more than there actually was because I mapped the projects in the Northwest 1 urban renewal area, which was actually mostly subsidized affordable housing, not public housing. And that's the Northwest 1 project. And I around the same time that these were built, also nearly 200 Black residents were displaced in the same area for the construction of 395. And also around 200 people were forced to move for the construction of the Southeast Freeway, also in 1965, I think close in the Capitol Hill area. Only one public housing development, a senior apartment building, had been created west of Rock Creek Park by 1980, and that remains the case today. DC also has something called scattered site public housing, made up of abandoned or condemned properties acquired by the Housing Authority beginning around 1970. There were more than 300 of these as of 1986. But some were given to nonprofit developers and others sold at market rate in 2015. All of those are shown with the X's, leaving only around 20 units throughout the city by this time. Meanwhile, the waiting list for public housing finally had closed altogether in 2013 after reaching 70,000 names. The city's inadequate supply of public housing has further plummeted in the past several decades. Rent vouchers have been provided to people displaced from public housing or for whom there has never been an opening, but the number of vouchers available is fairly limited. And the waiting list for these reached nearly 40,000 in 2017. And actually, I'm going to show you, if I can quickly get to the map of voucher distribution is also interesting. Can I make it show? Oh, I can't show you that. Forget that. Okay. So I will just say there's the map of voucher distribution shows the same kind of concentration of where vouchers are being used in the very same sort of far, east of the river, far northeast, southeast DC. Finally, much of DC's remaining public housing is now slated for private redevelopment. So this means that a lot more people will be required to vacate the places they live now. And so those are all the ones that we think are currently slated for private redevelopment are marked with red X's there. And then this last map shows all of the public housing currently slated for redevelopment, and also shows in blue and red developments that have already been built to replace public housing. These were built via the federal government's Hope 6 program, launched in the 1990s, and the DC's New Communities Initiative. These programs have subsidized the private redevelopment of public housing into mixed income sites that provide far less housing for those who can least afford it. And I think Michael will talk more about the new communities. This is the program under which DC's Berry Farm Dwellings is being redeveloped. And I'll say that Berry Farm is one of DC's most iconic public housing sites, in part because it was built on land taken from a longstanding Black land ownership community established just after the Civil War. And I'll just finish up with this map showing where the tenants of the displaced tenants of Berry Farm had moved to as of the publication of this map in 2018. They had been scattered all over the city with no timeline for when the site will be fully redeveloped and no guarantee that they will ever return. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Next up, we have Carolyn Swope. She is a doctoral student in urban planning at Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. She's interested in the relationship between housing and health equity, with particular attention to how historical housing policies have produced present-day housing disparities. Her dissertation research will examine how the legacy of historical dispossessions informs gentrification's impact on health for Black DC residents.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Swope, a PhD student in urban planning at Columbia. And my presentation will focus in on one of the particular processes of displacement that Sarah just discussed in alley communities. And I'd like to begin by thanking my co-panelists and our moderator for including me in this conversation. I think that it's so important to call attention to the continuities of these different processes of displacement over time, such that they are indeed serial. And I'm looking forward to discussing how all of our research fits together. And I'd also like to thank Sarah in particular for her contributions to this presentation, because she's helped with access to many archival documents that were critical to this work. So in the late 1800s through the mid 1900s, as we just briefly discussed, the interiors of many of the large blocks in the old city of Washington and in Georgetown were often filled with a second row of homes hidden from the streets, which primarily housed impoverished Black residents. Elite reformers engaged in a really aggressive campaign to eradicate these alleys, while at the same time, the changing morphology and needs of the 20th century city placed additional pressures on alley space, such that ultimately Black alley communities were completely wiped out. So in this presentation, I'll examine what happened to the space that used to be these homes and communities. So drawing on archival materials and using historical GIS, I'll identify for the first time the immediate next use of alley space after its final disappearance. So what alley space, what alley homes were cleared for. And I'll consider these findings in light of the historical context of the alley reform movement and the problems with it, and connect them to a framework of Black dispossession and draw on Black geographic scholarship. And examining the quote unquote better uses to which this space was put can provide insights about what was socially deemed to be more important than the homes of impoverished Black residents and shed light on the logic and assumptions that were driving its clearance. And ultimately, to give you a preview, I find that there was a really wide variety in what cleared alley space was cleared for, including for nothing at all, just left vacant. And at the root, I argue that the reason for this is that alleys as Black space were constructed as lacking in value and as destructible, such that many different pathways could all converge around tearing down alley homes. Tracking alley clearance offers us insight on how Black dispossession underlies the shape of the modern city. So first, a little more background about the alley typology. So in the map on the left, to give you a sense of how common these alleys were, this map shows each square that at some point between 1897 and 1945 contained an inhabited alley. So a little earlier of a time period than the one that Sarah showed earlier. And you can see that they're very common, very widely distributed. And so what that means is that they're not set apart in some faraway part of the city, but rather many alleys are occupying real estate in downtown areas, majority white neighborhoods close to the Capitol, that's perceived as valuable real estate. And the image on the right shows the conditions in alleys. And you know, it maybe doesn't look as nicely kept up as the street, but to me, it doesn't exactly look like a horrifying breeding ground of disease. But you can also see that they're not hidden away, again, on the outskirts of the city, but this is the Senate office building actually in the background there. So really prime real estate. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that alleys were distinctly Black spaces, you know, by the early 1900s, almost exclusively Black residents. In 1934, 98% Black. So in keeping with the purpose of this panel, I want to think about alley clearance here as a process of Black dispossession. And it was often framed and still is often understood as this benign housing reform effort where, you know, the alley homes were unsanitary, they were, you know, not fit places to live. And so it was a progressive housing reform movement to tear down alley homes. But instead, I think it's really important, and previous work has begun to highlight the racialized nature of alley clearance, including not only the disparate impact on Black residents, but also how alley reformers and planners' backgrounds as more elite white residents negatively influenced how they perceived alleys. And I'd also like to bring in a framework of Black geographies to deepen how we understand that from a theoretical perspective. So this is a branch of geography scholarship that points to the mutually constitutive nature of race and space. So urban spaces not only shows the existence of processes that have racialized impacts, but also racialized processes are enacted through space. So the devalorization of Black space, its rendering as pathological, is intertwined with constructing Black people as being deviant, as lacking spatial agency, as being other. So once these spaces are rendered as uninhabitable, then the barriers to their destruction are lowered, and it becomes perceived as justifiable to tear them down, to displace their residents, especially if there's some other use that white actors want from that space. So I want to use this framework to think about how at the root, the cause of alleys clearance is their social construction as Black spaces that are therefore uninhabitable, diseased, and decayed. Now, as Sarah mentioned, elite reformers campaigning for alley clearance argued that alleys were conducive to disease, crime, vice, you know, a whole host of social and physical pathologies. They described alleys as plague spots, pestiferous hovels, places where disease germs flourish and squalor and disorder run amok. In short, they were claimed to be places where neither decency nor sanitation was possible. And in particular, reformers expressed this worry that alley problems could expand beyond the alley boundaries to affect themselves. So definitely a self-interested component of this campaign. And this campaign was so powerful that, as Sarah talked about earlier, this alley dwelling authority was created with the power to clear out squares containing inhabited alleys. And on the other hand, at the same time, there are these quote unquote natural processes too. So as the changing needs of the 20th century city creates these more profitable potential alternative uses of downtown real estate, we see things like the invention of the automobile and the corresponding need for parking downtown, for example. So these uses aren't setting out with a primary purpose of alleys destruction, right? But they can also have the effect of destroying alleys. But again, these changes to urban morphology, where clearing alleys is seen as the solution for something like the need for parking, is occurring in a context where alley dwellings are already seen as disposable. Black geography scholarship also urges us to challenge representation of Black space as dead and decaying. So I want to emphasize that alleys were people's homes, which offered much needed shelter and support in a discriminatory housing market in a city where Black people were marginalized. As the folklife scholar James Borchert argues, alleys residents built strong and closely knit communities. And accordingly, I want to be clear that the construction of alleys as places that needed to be destroyed as unsanitary was not an objective one. Reformers exaggerated the harmfulness of the alley environment as their biases led them to perceive alleys as pathological. So really quickly here on this map, you see when the very last house in an alley was torn down, when the alley totally disappeared. And this is based mostly off various surveys of alleys by city agencies, including a recent historic alley building survey of extant buildings led by the DC Office of Historic Preservation. And you can see just the scale of destruction, right? That almost every inhabited alley, all the ones in green, did disappear. And the few alleys that still exist in orange are kind of the exception that proves the rule, as these are places that white residents moved into as these neighborhoods started gentrifying in the 40s and 50s. You can see, Georgetown, Capitol Hill, Foggy Bottom, which Rebecca Summers done some really interesting work about. And you can also see alley clearance was this really sustained effort, right? There was already so much destruction in the map that Sarah showed us earlier. And here we see even more alleys being cleared before and after that. So finally here we see what actually happened to that space. So this is tracking exactly what replaced the last set of dwellings to be torn down in an alley. Drawing on archival records from city agencies and fire insurance maps. And a limitation I'll note is that this only tracks what happened to those very last dwellings. So, maybe if 10 dwellings were torn down in 1920 and 10 were torn down in 1930, this is only looking at what happened to those 1930 ones. But it gives us at least a rough sense. So what I want to emphasize first is you see there's really a pretty big mix here, right? There's not one big change to urban form where it's essential for all of the interiors of squares to be, say, changed into parking lots or torn down for commercial buildings that are taking up the whole square. There's a lot of different things that are replacing alley dwellings. And I'll talk more about that, but a couple specific uses that I want to highlight. So about a third of alleys were either converted into garage stables or parking, or were simply left vacant. So that means that parking a car or literally making no use whatsoever of the space was thought to be more important than having someone's home there. And we see parking, especially just outside of downtown, unsurprisingly, in that sort of beige color, alley space left vacant, that maroon color, we see that all over the city. I also want to point out how many federal government buildings were constructed on sites of cleared alleys. You see that green cluster around the Capitol for federal buildings. Yet official narratives about the history of these buildings, don't mention these communities which were displaced, who had to leave in order for it to rise, which, given the fact that this is the site of supposedly our nation's democracy, seems like a pretty jarring omission. And finally, I want to highlight how few alleys were converted to public or subsidized housing. Even though one of the chief arguments made for alley demolition was that the conditions of alley dwellings were so unsanitary that no one could live there, the destruction of residents' homes was largely not accompanied by the provision of alternative acceptable homes. Of course, even when that was the case and housing was provided on that site, it doesn't mean that the clearance and displacement was not problematic, as Johanna will discuss after me. So I'm going to walk through quickly a couple of different instances of alley clearance to show you how it unfolded. So here I've focused in on the first alley that was destroyed by the ADA, which was replaced by a parking lot. So this is in Foggy Bottom between EF 20th and 21st Streets. So on the left, I've mapped out the race of the head of household for the entire square in 1910. And then you can see what the footprint looked like in 1939 after the ADA cleared the alley. So you can see that every inhabited alley dwelling had Black residents, whereas there were white residents on the northern half of the square. And after ADA clearance, all of the alley dwellings, as well as a number of street dwellings inhabited by Black residents, are gone. And you can actually see the lot lines of where those dwellings used to be and get a sense of the scale of that teardown. But no dwelling of any white residents has been demolished. And here you can see what that transformation to a parking lot looked like. Now, building this parking lot here was not urgently needed. In fact, the ADA originally intended to develop it as low rent housing for white households, even though all the displaced households were Black. But it just decided to use it as a parking lot for a while, quote, in case some federal department desires it for building purposes. The motivation was that alleys were seen, as you can see in this quote on the left, they were seen as spreading their infection through the square. The motivation was not the need for a parking lot. These projects' relative unimportance and the choice not to construct housing for the displaced residents instead attracted criticism from the Black community. The Federation of Civic Associations, the main mouthpiece for civic participation for Black residents, issued a resolution stating that the ADA had disregarded human habitation by removing dwellings, scattering and not rehousing former tenants, erected garages, parking lots, and disposing by sale suitable sites. Its housing committee chair pointed out in congressional testimony that Black residents had lived in the alleys and streets of this square for scores of years. And he asked, when we noticed this site being used for the parking of automobiles and realizing the plight the former tenants were put to, the most natural question arose, is human habitation secondary to the parking of automobiles? But the ADA did not actually tear down proportionally that large of a proportion of alleys. Again, this process unfolded over a very long period of time, many different pathways to alley clearance. So I'll quickly show another example where we don't just have one agency coming in and destroying the alley all at once, and it's converted to one subsequent use, but it's happening over time in kind of a haphazard process. So you can see here the loss of these homes in this alley across this 50-year period. Sitting vacant for a really long period of time, being converted to garages, some still left vacant, a couple pulled into street buildings after a while, but only they've been allowed to sit there for a while. And some street buildings are gone, but very few, right? So where previously we had 71 alley homes here, now we have 0. And the majority of these homes are replaced with nothing. So again, we see there's not some immediate pressing need that is prompting the alley destruction. So in conclusion, in this presentation, I identify for the first time what cleared alley space was cleared for. And the variety of subsequent uses to which this space was put suggests that there were a range of needs or problems or concerns for which the answer was always seen as alley destruction. The common thread in alley clearance is alley clearance. Now, often, of course, the entire purpose was alley destruction, like with the ADA, but even in the case of quote unquote natural processes of urban change, you could ask, why did the changing needs for space in the city so consistently manifest in this way, where alley clearance was the way that they found to get that space? Why did all of them converge on that? And so I argue what truly sounded the death knell for alley dwellings was the fact that they were marginalized Black space. And because of that, this space was viewed as uninhabitable, as pathological, as fundamentally destructible, and even in need of destruction. And any use of space was seen as more valuable, even if it was no use of space. When a city planning agency refers to the homes of the most marginalized as an infection, we can see how alleys are rendered as unlivable space, even as a threat to the spaces of people whose bodies are more valued. So coming back to the theme of this panel, as Sarah pointed out, this way of understanding alley clearance as Black displacement lets us put it in conversation with other processes of Black displacement in DC, forming part of that chain of serial exclusion and displacement based on framing people framing Black people as devaluing and Black space as devalued, a logic that we can see across all of these processes that we're discussing. The clearance of DC's alleys contributed to increasingly segregated neighborhoods built on Black displacement and provides a unique case study of how these processes work. So you can see here some references, and thank you so much for your attention and the opportunity to share this.
As Carolyn mentioned, next up we have Johanna Bachman. She's an associate professor of global affairs and sociology at George Mason University. She is conducting research on one block on Capitol Hill, documenting the multiple displacements and globalizations moving through the block over a 120-year period. She reports on this project on her blog, Sociology in My Neighborhood, DC Ward 6, and is a founding member of the Cities and Globalization Working Group. And I had the pleasure of hosting her on our radio show recently, so thank you.
Okay, so hi, I've been working on this project for several years, and I'm working on one block. The block is generally around 6th and G Southeast, so it's near the freeway on Capitol Hill in Southeast. And basically, this has been a site of numerous displacements. And so in 1891, there was the creation of the Navy Place Alley. And this is my very, very high-tech blue line there, shows you where Navy Place Alley is, with 70 brick houses there, housing, by this point in time in 1909, housing 344 residents, primarily African Americans. In 1939, the Alley Dwelling Authority, which many people have brought up already, destroyed the Navy Place Alley and built the Ellen Wilson dwellings, which was a segregated white public housing project. Then a couple years after desegregation began, the city decided to destroy the Ellen Wilson dwellings completely and to allow for the construction of the Southeast Freeway. But then they decided to only destroy part of it and displace some people. And then in 1988, everyone was displaced to repair it, the Ellen Wilson dwellings, but then in the end, it was destroyed by Hope 6. So, and a mixed income development was put in many, many years later. So we can see on this one block, we can see numerous displacements occurring. But today, actually, I want to talk about how residents on this block, and I would say probably everywhere in the city, successfully actually stop displacement. And so what we can see under all forms of displacement, the years before it are successes, that they are stopping displacement until the displacement happens. So in this case, the Navy Place Alley, there were threats already to it in 1892, and it wasn't destroyed until 1939. So there was a success of stopping displacement and destruction on the part of these people. So so these are the strategies that these people use. So these are not all the strategies. So the throwing of rocks, confronting people physically, home improvement, refusing to budge, restoration, and the killing of pets. So these are, so the Navy Place Alley, as I said, maybe I don't need to see this. Basically, James Butchert, the alley dwelling historian, noted that alley dwellers all across the city lived in continual dread of the demolition of their homes, and others often spoke of others who had been forced to move and had no place to go. So this in Navy Place Alley was a very well-founded fear of being displaced. And so we have about 30 years of success on this block, but I'm looking at actually a little bit later than the beginning of their successes. I'm looking at starting at 1920, because that's what I have evidence for them actually actively taking action. In 1919, we see an incredible rise. There's already huge amounts of racism in the city, but in 1919, there's race riots, and then through the 1920s, there are mass KKK marches in Washington, DC, and a great rise in racism. So at this point in time, the Navy Place Alley residents are really very worried about their housing. And this is because they see several significant visitors to their alley. So In 1920, the Navy Place Alley had these several visitors. At the beginning of the year, a US Census worker arrived at the alley, but she refused to enter due to what she said was the feeling that the alley was forbidding. The police they also had done censuses earlier. They studied these alley dwellings and knowing who lived where. The police also were did arrests and beat residents. So a census employee coming would be perceived probably like the police and would be a very unwelcome visitor. So also census workers might also provide information to government employees that would give evidence that this area should be destroyed. So this after this census worker refused to enter the alley, a census inspector arrived later to continue the work and was told by a resident at the first house in Navy Place Alley that he should leave or be shot. By the third house, the inspector was chased out of the alley by a hail of stones. The newspaper reported, thoroughly aroused and breathing defiance to the invader, many of the inhabitants of Navy Place poured out of their homes and set to work repelling the unwelcome visitor with stones and sticks. The next morning, the inspector returned with a policeman to continue his work, and he claimed to have no trouble. So in Navy Place, census workers often meant trouble and likely increased the feeling of dread. Okay, so 4 months after the visit of the census workers, there is a visit by Congressman George H. Tickton, I'm going to say his name right, Tickham of Massachusetts, and there's a group with the U.S. House. There's a committee for them to go on a tour of various blocks in alley dwellings. So Congressman and his entourage arrive. And they're making a tour of the alleys and slums in the national capital, that's their words, with a view of urging congressional action to do away with these sections. So this visit was a real threat to the people in the alley. And even though one of the people in this, the man 3 from the left, this is Reverend Waldron. Reverend Waldron who was advocating for the destruction of the alley dwellings, but he said he wanted to have the alley dwelling residents, the alley residents, to have housing that was better. So he was advocating for the replacement of housing. But it was pretty clear to anyone involved that this housing was never going to be given to the alley dwelling, the people living in the alley. So, but here, this is a picture of this visit. We can see that there's something already going on in the visit. The man this man on the 2 from the right looks like he's talking to someone off out of the picture. 2 people are looking at themselves, like smiling and kind of looking at each other like, can you believe what he's saying? This other guy on the right is looking very, very nervous, right? So there's a lot of tension in this picture. So this second photo shows the congressman, and it was taken after the other picture, and he shows that this shows some of the people they're speaking to. So the tour group is walking to the cars that they arrived in. The congressman is stopped in front of one of the doors, 722 Navy Place. And at the center of the photo, he looks in control of the situation. Yet the action around him suggests otherwise. To his right is likely Annie Young. She's in the window to the right, and she is turned away with an angry look. Maybe she has said something to him. Annie Young was born in 1883 in DC. She's 37 years old, and she can read and write, according to the census. She was living here with her husband, Joseph, and her children, Charles, Mary, John, and Arthur. Annie Young may have asked her children, possibly Arthur and John, to lie down on the door stoop so that the visitors could not enter her home. The Reverend Waldron's wife is heading quickly to the car, which brought them there, to tell the driver something in a seemingly urgent way. Maybe they should go soon, that the alley is no longer in control. 2 men in bowler hats have their hands on their hips, turned to face Tickham to see what will happen. Tickham has asked, is turning to someone behind him, visible only by her foot. So you can see that blue line, there's a foot there. he turns to this young girl, possibly Annie Young's daughter, Mary, or likely some other much younger resident, who is speaking to him with her feet planted firmly. Was she protesting their plans to do away with these sections and destroy her homes in the name of helping her? Navy Place was not destroyed, so for all we know, this young resident actually stopped him in 1920. Okay, back to this. So we've done throwing rocks, confronting people physically, now home improvement. Well before the Capitol Hill Restoration Society was created, Navy Place residents actively took part in neighborhood home improvement, is the word they used. These activities were done specifically to protect their houses from being destroyed. For years, the DC Health Department condemned buildings and destroyed them. And within this context, in order to protect their investments, the people who actually owned the alley dwellings would in fact destroy the alleys and replace them with garages. And so this is where we see the garage replacement happening in Navy Place. They were looking for other kinds of lucrative investments rather than having nothing there at all, is what these people were saying. So Congress ramped up the threat to alley dwelling communities by creating the Alley Dwelling Authority in 1934, which was the primary purpose of the Alley Dwelling Authority, was to destroy alley dwellings. So there were many attempts by people in Navy Place to do renovations and to improve their houses. And so we can see this in the building permits. One of the interesting people that was living in the alley was James Harrison. The grocer, which were Jewish people from Russia, the Kartoffels, owned the grocery in the middle of the block, in the middle of the alley. And they had improved their grocery store, had done repairs, but then they decided to give the housing, some of their alley dwellings, to some of the people who lived there. So James Harrison and Arthur Dates begin to own their own housing in the area. And they, James Harrison hires an architect, Louis Wentworth Giles, to replace his wood-framed kitchen and to build a brick one. So he went so far to do this as an attempt to protect his house from being destroyed. And there are many, many improvements that are made like this in the alley. But because of the Alley Dwelling Authority in 1934 being created, in 1935 and 1936, the Afro-American newspaper started the citywide Clean Blockers contest. And it was a way to stop what they called community segregation through housing improvement. And so Nannie Helen Burroughs played a central role in these contests. And so it was, the basic idea was they were trying to convince white elites that African-American homes were not slums or blighted, and that these houses should not be destroyed. So Navy Place was one of the main locations of the Clean Blockers contest. One of the residents, Inez Brown, won at $1 for her great work in the contest. John Campbell, a retired post office employee, lived in Navy Place, and he was the honorary district chairman of the contest. And he said, "I have been helping to keep this block clean for 39 years. So in addition to cleaning, the Navy Place, also the houses there were painted, and it's also the city came by and cleaned up the drains and things like that. So this was the Navy Place residents themselves mobilized this housing improvement in order to protect themselves. And they successfully did protect themselves until 1939. Okay, so the fourth one is refusing to budge. Now, this could be said to not be particularly successful exactly. Basically, what happened was in 1939, the Alley Dwelling Authority had been wanting to destroy Navy Place and finally did in 1939. And basically, the Navy Place households just refused to move. So the machines are in the alley, just ripping down houses. People are in their houses still trying to stay. So they're pulling down the house next door. They're still there. And then their house is being pulled down and they have to escape. So these people are waiting to the last minute to protect their housing. And So it wasn't actually at that very moment successful, but to know that people would do this meant that people didn't want to leave. It was well known that they didn't want to leave. And it also meant to the Alley Dwelling Authority that you can't do this to people because they will stay. And this is, and you have to deal with the impact of that. So this is an image to others that is an impact also on the way the city did things. Okay, so on the block though, you have to know that that there is the most of the block is this Ellen Wilson dwellings now in 1939, a white segregated housing project. But as Carolyn was saying, there were blocks where the northern white part is left without being destroyed. And this was the same place, same thing with this block. There was a northern strip of houses that are owned by white people, and the white people live in those houses. And those houses were not destroyed. So, but the city had wanted to destroy the houses on this block at these houses also, because they wanted to create this kind of road right through the block and to have more control over the space. So in 1945, Hazel Scafie Detweiler moved into one of the houses that was supposed to be destroyed, and she wanted to stay on the block. So she mobilized a home improvement contest on her own on the north end of the block in 1948. And this actually created something different. Rather than being called home improvement, this was called restoration, and became the Restoration Society, the Capitol Hill Restoration Society. So, but in addition to this restoration, which I've talked about in other situations before, it was very, very racist. Another strategy that she used and other people used to protect their housing was to make certain that African Americans around them were displaced. So the Navy Place alley had already been displaced, but there was an alley across the street from her to the north. This was the F Street Terrace alley. And she decided that these people should also be displaced. And so this place, the F Street Terrace alley, was where people from Navy Place alley moved to in an attempt to stay near their friends and family in the area. In 1952, Christ Church, the church on Capitol Hill, and its members, led by Detweiler, took up their own, what they called their own slum clearance program they did themselves. They decided to go out there and destroy the dwellings and F Street dwellings behind the church. The church owned those buildings, and as an act of what they called restoration, they raised the buildings as a special contribution to Washington's slum clearance program. And she then established the Neighborhood Restoration Committee, and she offered to find people the appropriate kind of residents for the neighborhood to replace the people that were restoring houses in the area. So 6, let's see. 6, killing of pets. This would also be seen possibly as not a completely successful strategy, but just days before the F Street Terrace buildings were razed, the newspaper reported that the residents of the block where Hazel Detweiler lived were reported in an uproar yesterday over the slaughter of most of the cats and dogs on the street. 37 cats and 2 dogs were killed. The cat of Hazel Detweiler's sister, Eliza, and the dog of her roommate were also killed. The newspaper claimed that rat poison laid to de-rat the houses had killed them all. One could imagine, though, that someone decided to show the comfortable residents of G Street, the 600 block of G Street, some of the feeling of the violence that they had inflicted on the residents of F Street Terrace, some of whom had been displaced from Navy Place before and possibly from other alleys nearby. And that, in fact, even though they had been multiply displaced, they had also been successful at earlier times of stopping displacement. So these are just some of the strategies that I see in this particular block being used for people to protect themselves. But, and these are successful at sometimes and then become unsuccessful at others. So thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. I think we're going to ask Empower DC to get a budget for sticks and stones for next year. So hopefully that'll help. Lastly, Michael R. Fisher Jr., PhD, is a assistant professor of African American Studies in the College of Social Sciences, and affiliate faculty in the Department of Humanities in the College of Humanities and the Arts at San Jose University. He is also an affiliate scholar at the Metropolitan Policy Center in the School of Public Affairs at American University. Michael specializes in Black religion and cultural studies, race and socioeconomic inequity, and ethics and public policy.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. You all okay? Okay. I like call and response. All right. Story time. Are you ready? All right. On April 24th, 2021, I attended a town hall meeting on public housing hosted on Zoom by Empower DC, hosted by that guy right over there, a local nonprofit in the nation's capital whose mission is to promote the well-being and self-advocacy of low-income and moderate-income DC residents. The town hall assembled a group of current and former public housing tenants to discuss the lack of investments in infrastructure in public housing and services for tenants, and to share their firsthand accounts of residential displacement and their insights from the fight to hold the city council and mayor accountable to a commitment to poor and low-income residents in DC. Jasmine, and I've changed her name for this presentation, a then 36-year-old Black woman and native Washingtonian with a 20+ year history living in Berry Farm dwellings, a former public housing property in Berry Farm, shared her story. Jasmine and her young daughter were displaced from the Berry Farm neighborhood in 2018 because of planned redevelopment under the city's New Communities Initiative. And you've heard a little bit about that. The New Communities Initiative, and I'll say a little bit more about that in just a minute, began in 2005 as a replica of the Federal Housing Opportunities for People Everywhere, or HOPE 6 program, and was designed to, quote, revitalize severely distressed public housing and redevelop communities plagued with concentrated poverty, high crime, and economic segregation, end quote. The vision of the initiative from its inception was the creation of, quote, vibrant mixed income neighborhoods that address both the physical architecture and human capital needs, where residents have quality of affordable housing options, economic opportunities, and access to appropriate human services, end quote. DC, like many other cities across the country, is implementing multi-million-dollar projects to transform public housing properties into mixed income neighborhoods. Between 1993 and 2007, the federal government awarded DC over $180 million through HOPE 6 revitalization grants to transform 7 public housing properties into mixed income neighborhoods. The idea that social mix, the integration of racially and economically diverse people within historically disadvantaged and divested areas, leads to improved outcomes for poor and low income tenants, has fundamentally driven public housing reform in the US and elsewhere for the last several decades. Proponents of mixed income housing creation in high poverty neighborhoods justify its use as urban social policy on the grounds that, number one, it expands the social networks of the urban poor and increases their social capital. Number two, provides effective social control in high poverty neighborhoods and increases accountability and safety. Number three, promotes role modeling in the adaptation of desirable behavior. And number four, attracts economic investment and resources to urban poor communities. Yet that has not been Jasmine's experience. During the town hall, she shared her sense of isolation from her new neighbors and the impact on her health. And I quote her here, "It does something mentally because I'm not mingling with people. So I'm like sheltered in the house more, gaining weight. And then we had the pandemic, but all of that is like a big issue. I'm just worried about my health and my mental health and my physical health. I don't need to get heart disease or diabetes from basically being stressed and depressed," end quote. The DC Housing Authority, or DCHA, relocated Jasmine and her daughter to Deanwood, a redeveloped mixed income neighborhood in Washington, D.C. In 2018, the Washington Post reported that the real estate brokerage firm Redfin named Deanwood one of the, quote, 10 hottest neighborhoods in the country, end quote. Deanwood reflects the ideal of a mixed income neighborhood, poor and low income residents spatially integrated with middle and high income earners in redeveloped urban space. According to the Washington Post, between June of 2017 and July of 2018, 310 properties in Deanwood sold at prices ranging from, are you ready? $90,000 to $1.1 million. During that time, Jasmine's family moved into the neighborhood. Sadly, after 3 years there at the time of the public housing town hall, Jasmine stated that she didn't know any of her new neighbors and hadn't established any significant relationships. That isolation compounds her sense of loss of community, networks, and close ties that she enjoyed in Berry Farm. For Jasmine and others like her, moving into a mixed income neighborhood hasn't significantly improved her quality of life. And hers is an unfortunate yet familiar story. Studies of the consequences for displaced public housing tenants who moved into mixed income neighborhoods indicates that public housing reform as urban social policy is a policy failure on the grounds that it pushes poverty to other areas within cities and doesn't largely produce the outcomes alleged by its proponents. In fact, residential, cultural, and political displacement of predominantly Black tenants who live in high poverty areas is, I would argue, the most salient consequence of the creation of mixed income neighborhoods. From the mid-20th century to the present, the redevelopment of such areas has been a historic catalyst for the demise of these communities that live in them. It is this aspect of public housing reform that is my primary concern here. So in the time that I have remaining, I want to talk about the New Communities Initiative and the push to turn Berry Farm into a mixed income neighborhood. The initiative, which is jointly managed by the DC Housing Authority and the Deputy Mayor's Office of Planning and Economic Development, began, as I said, in 2005. And at its inception, 4 guiding principles shaped its design. Number 1, ensure one-for-one replacement of raised housing in order to safeguard that there is, quote, and I'm quoting from the New Communities Initiative, no net loss of affordable housing units in redeveloped neighborhoods, end quote. Number 2, honor the right of tenants to remain during redevelopment or shortly return after completion. Number 3, develop mixed income housing as the strategy to address concentrated poverty. And number 4, execute a build first philosophy, which calls for the redevelopment of new housing to begin prior to the demolition of existing distressed housing in order to minimize displacement. Berry Farm was selected as the initiative's 3rd site, quote, because of its visible location in Anacostia and the need to bring the promise and opportunities provided with this initiative east of the Anacostia River. A community with a high concentration of crime and poverty, the neighborhood is in pressing need of the services and opportunities presented by the New Communities Initiative, end quote. The initiative called for the demolition of Berry Farm dwellings in order to build in its place mixed income housing. It also calls for a neighborhood redesign, the goal of which is to, quote, eliminate the isolation of Berry Farm and integrate it with the broader Anacostia community, end quote. The original redevelopment plan claims that the proposed urban design expands the existing neighborhood's connection, quote, to the surrounding communities and bolsters the site's ability to maintain a comfortable environment. So this is a screen grab from the redevelopment plan. This is what Berry Farm dwellings looked like before it was demolished. This is an aerial photo from Google Maps of the same property and what it looks like today. You will see that for the most part, it's completely empty except for 5 buildings right here that are only there because Berry Farm tenants and allies fought to have those 5 buildings remain as a site for commemoration. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later. In the 17 years since the initial planned redevelopment of Berry Farm, and we are now talking 17 years later, the city has produced no new housing of any sort in the community and has only produced 1 new building in the neighborhood, the Berry Farm Recreational Center, which opened in 2015. In fact, as one local journalist declared, the new communities program has failed to produce new communities, end quote. In 2017, DCHA received approval to begin demolition of the public housing in Berry Farm, but by then the city had already reneged on the core commitments adopted to guide redevelopment under the New Communities Initiative. DCHA announced in September of 2016 that the Build First approach was cost prohibitive for Berry Farm. Consequently, the agency said, Berry Farm dwellings tenants would be relocated. The city also arguably broke its promise for one-for-one replacement units at the new property. There were originally 444 public housing units in Berry Farm dwellings. The redevelopment plan only called for 344 replacement units. The remaining 100 units, according to DCHA, would be spread throughout other developments across the city. While DCHA argued that the city was honoring the one-for-one replacement principle, the net loss of 100 units in Berry Farm is an unequivocal violation of the city's promise to tenants that it would implement redevelopment in such a way that it would prevent residential displacement and relocation from their base community. To add insult to injury, the one-for-one replacement principle didn't extend to the mix of various sizes of units, a problem that tenants themselves raised repeatedly with city leaders. At issue is the net loss of housing units available for large families. The proposed redevelopment would have had a net fewer of 2 to 6 bedroom units, and as a result, analysts projected that the redeveloped property would net displace more than 150 families, assuming that all original displaced tenants and families who desire to return could do so. Tenants allege that the decrease in family unit sizes reflects city leaders' desires to, quote, reduce the number of low-income tenants with children to make the redeveloped complex more attractive to market rate renters and buyers, end quote. Against the objections of public housing tenants, DCHA began moving them out of Berry Farm during the summer of 2017 in advance of planned demolition. At that time, a spokesman for DCHA stated that, quoting again, all families affected by the relocation will be offered a comparable home in the district during the relocation phase of redevelopment. Those who are interested in returning to the property after Berry Farm is redeveloped will be offered an opportunity to return to the new development, end quote. Some tenants left willingly with hopes of eventual return. Those who refused to leave voluntarily were served multiple eviction notices. Many responded to DCHA's claims with skepticism and for good reason. Strict screening standards often prevent the return of public housing tenants to a redeveloped property. And it is worth underscoring that an offer for the opportunity to return is by no means a guarantee of return after redevelopment is complete. In April of 2018, the DC Court of Appeals ruled in favor of a lawsuit filed against the city by the Berry Farm Tenants and Allies Association, who claimed that the city failed to consider the adverse impact of redevelopment on their well-being. The Court of Appeals agreed with the plaintiffs that there would be a net loss of 100 units in Berry Farm under the redevelopment plan, and it also raised the problem of displacement, which it found was inconsistent with the New Communities Initiative. The court ruled that the city failed to consider the adverse impact of redevelopment on Berry Farm dwellings tenants, and the ruling brought redevelopment plans in the neighborhood to a temporary halt. Despite the court's ruling, DCHA moved forward with demolition and continued to remove tenants from Berry Farm dwellings against their wishes. At its height, hundreds of families called Berry Farm dwellings home. Today, no one lives there because it no longer exists, at least as it once did. This past January marked the 3-year anniversary of the removal of the last tenants from Berry Farm dwellings. And regardless of the various obstacles and opposition, the city has doubled down on its redevelopment agenda, along with the developer, ironically named Preservation of Affordable Housing, all with no satisfactory path forward, and all at the expense of the very people for whom it claims urban redevelopment is designed to benefit. Many Berry Farm community members, however, have made clear their opposition. Reflecting the sentiments of others, one person declared, quote, "We don't want mixed income communities with market rate people. That's when discrimination and other issues come in," end quote. What the New Communities Initiative has effectively done is displace those who called Berry Farm home. The story of Berry Farm illustrates the adverse impact of the creation of mixed income neighborhoods on Black communities who live in high poverty neighborhoods. Public housing reform has essentially been a tool to purge poor people from housing, and herein lies its peril. Even when Berry Farm is eventually redeveloped, and it will eventually be redeveloped, elements of the community's character and spirit are likely lost forever. As developers, elected officials, and others aggressively march toward their vision of a new urban frontier in the nation's capital, one marked by the unencumbered circulation and accumulation of capital, Berry Farm appears to be an acceptable sacrifice in the city's pursuit of urban and economic growth and development. And in fact, the history of urban renewal and public housing reform shows that the evolution of US cities is built on and predicated by the death of poor Black communities. And this should trouble us all. Thank you. I look forward to the conversation.
Just add to Michael's presentation that the mayor just in her budget that she's presented, she wants to give the New Communities Initiative $219 million more dollars to go towards Berry Farm. So, you know, take that for what it's worth. Let's thank the panelists again for their very informative presentations. I don't know if we have time for questions or, okay, so. Okay, I don't know, any closing thoughts or wrap it up? All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for your time.
Whoops. I'll just say that mine was based very closely on an online exhibit that can be found at mappingsegregationdc.org. That's called Mapping Displacement.
I'm happy to share mine if there's a way that the conference organizers can facilitate it. I don't think slides are available anywhere to the public right now, but I'm happy to do so if there's a channel.
Mine is not available because it's in a book project that I'm currently working on, a manuscript for which I'm supposed to turn in next year. We'll see if it happens on time.
Soon.
I think there's a question back there.
There we go. Boom. So part of the reason why the New Communities Initiative has stalled was because of financing issues, right? And so the 2008 housing bubble crash that led to the Great Recession was one of those issues that delayed further financing of the project, and of course then delayed whether the redevelopment plans were going to be initiated or when they were going to be initiated. So the 2008 crisis did play a role. Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the appeal, I mean, what essentially happened was the city withdrew its, what they call the PUD, the Planned Unit Development, the development plan for Berry Farm. They withdrew it and just said, we'll be back. And then they rezoned Berry Farm, so it could be a matter of right development. So they just went around the whole process essentially. So right now there's no sort of agreements that need to be made with the community, with the ANCs. They're just rolling over it. Yeah.
And then I know the city came back recently, like in the last 2-3 years during the pandemic, and did that. So I was asking, like, the part of the appeal, like that part, how did that play a role in like what ended up happening with the delay, all of that? Because I think you're talking about the rezoning by recent.
Well, it's all part of that whole, event. But I mean, I think that they've used it. The developers have used it. They don't have anything stopping them now, and I don't think they have the financing, and they're just using time and their political connections to be able to run out the clock essentially on residents, because since they were able to move forward because HUD approved the demolition of Berry Farm. So the development's moving on another track. They could have done whatever they wanted.
I mean, I'll just say that these, even like absent of any a pushback on this process, like it can take, when these sites are redeveloped, it takes a very long time. And the process, like even before anybody gets to be displaced from the site, there's like conversation around it happening for years before that even starts. So this process of destabilizing people can go on for more than a decade or more, in advance of people being pushed off the site, then being off the site, not knowing when they're coming back to the site. And so I think you said 17 years since this process started at Berry Farm. That's like not atypical. The same thing's happening at Park Morton.
I was going to say the same thing's happening at the other sites.
Was it the Park Morton one is also because I believe, and when I read the area where they're trying to build it, I think the residents surrounding that also sued, and then it was vacated because the building was too big. For those that were supposed to be moved to Park Morton.
That's the Bruce Monroe part of the redevelopment. We haven't seen anything happen on the actual footprint of Park Morton, so it's more of the same.
Yep.
So I was just wondering when I was listening to you, Michael, but also I was wondering with you two too, is this idea of the sort of the destruction and redevelopment of public housing a way to destroy people's political power? These are places of organizing from the beginning, right? These public housing projects. Do you see this as also not just an economic growth argument, but actually a destruction of political power by the public housing residents?
So I'll keep it quick because I know people are sweating. The organizers are sweating for the next session. So I think what is driving it is the pursuit of economic growth and development in U.S. cities, right? This need to compete, right? And this idea that if cities don't compete, they will die, right? This goes back to people like David Harvey, who talks about a change in urban governance from managerialism to entrepreneurialism, right? And so when we see this push for economic growth and development, what happens is that some of the political organizing, these places that were happening in these public housing communities, right, were actual communities, all of this becomes kind of collateral damage, right? That there might not be actual intent, depending on how you look at it, right? I mean, because there is certainly an intent to take back the property, right? Because the ways in which we connect property and people, and the ways in which property is racialized, right? Particularly public housing, and the way that poverty is racialized. I think that was mentioned earlier by earlier panelists, right? How we think about the people who are in these places and the value that's attached to them, right? And so when we recognize that for many city leaders, and I'm not making a sweeping statement that, so I'm not saying all, but for many, if some is a better word for you, you can take that one. There is this drive to, push economic growth and development, which means getting the property back. And so if the people and the communities who are occupying, are an obstacle, it's an acceptable sacrifice, right? And so that is part of the tension when we talk about particularly housing as for exchange value, right? That housing for so many people is, its value comes in its use, raising families, building communities, right? And so when we've got this tension with people who actually want to use the property for an exchange, right, to help drive kind of economic growth and development, we see a tension here, and more often than not, the people with the power, when we're talking about political connections, money and whatnot, often end up winning. That was longer than I anticipated. I'm sorry, but I'm done.